Sometimes the person who saves a family isn't the one who walks in with answers, but the one who quietly brings dinner. When a weary single father hired a widow to cook for his 7 children, he expected warm meals. What he got was healing forgiveness and a second chance at love, one meal at a time. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you never miss a moment that might just change everything. Now let's begin. The kettle hissed, then fell silent like it had given up waiting to be noticed. Callan Brody didn't move. He sat at the edge of the kitchen table, elbows resting heavily on its worn cedar grain, eyes staring through the steam-streaked window at the frozen hayfield beyond. A late March wind howled against the boards of the Montana farmhouse, rattling loose gutters and reminding him that spring was late. Again. Behind him, 7 mismatched cereal bowls sat in a crooked line on the counter, some half full, some untouched, all the milk already warm. "Grab your boots," he barked toward the hallway. "Bus'll be here in 10. A stampede of limbs and arguments thundered down the stairs, Isley crying because she couldn't find her hairbrush, the twins wrestling over who took the last banana Thatcher, his oldest dead, silent as always, trailing behind the chaos like a shadow. Callan didn't look up. He just sipped bitter black coffee and let the noise pass through him like fog. It had been 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days since the laughter had gone. Since the morning he sat beside his wife's hospital bed, gripping her cooling fingers, while trying to make promises he knew he couldn't keep. Like, "I'll keep them safe," like, "I'll make sure they still smile." But some promises die when the person you made them to stops breathing. That morning, like all others, moved with mechanical rhythm. The bus arrived. The kids spilled out the front door, bundled and bickering, and Callan was left alone again in a house that echoed too much. He turned toward the sink, stared at the crusted dishes from the night before. There had been spaghetti, or at least something like it. A faint smell of scorched tomato sauce still lingered in the air. He scrubbed one pan listlessly, then gave up halfway and ran water over it instead. That's when he saw the note on the fridge. Callan meeting moved to 2 p.m. Don't forget to bring the zoning paperwork. Paul. Right. The barn expansion, the permits, life kept moving. The problem was he didn't. That evening dinner was late again. Isley sat at the table quietly peeling a string cheese. One of the twins had a stomachache. The younger boys tried to microwave frozen pizza, but the crust came out like cardboard. The baby of the family 6-year-old, Penny, looked up from her chair and whispered, "Can we have real food tomorrow?" Callan's jaw tensed. He wanted to snap back, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he cleared his voice and muttered, "I'll figure something out." Later that night, after they'd all gone to bed, he sat alone in the living room, the glow of the fireplace flickering across the faces in the framed photo above the mantel. His wife Marley had been so radiant that day, barefoot in the grass, baby Penny on her hip, laughter frozen forever in that frame. He stood up, heart pounding with a mix of grief and guilt, and went to his desk. Pulling out a yellow notepad, he scribbled 2 words at the top, "Cook needed." He hesitated, then added, "Part-time. Family of 8. Must be able to handle chaos. Pay negotiable. Start ASAP." Below that, his number. Nothing more. No flourish, no warmth. Just a man too tired to explain why he couldn't do it all anymore. The next morning, he pinned the paper to the notice board outside the feed store in town. By noon, 2 calls had come in. One hung up after hearing 7 kids. The other sounded young and chipper until she realized the position didn't come with free housing or a bonus. He stopped checking the phone after that. By sundown, he was back to burning scrambled eggs. It wasn't until Tuesday morning that a knock came at the back screen door, firm, polite, and unexpected. Callan opened it cautiously, bracing for another salesperson or social worker. Instead, A woman stood there in a powder blue coat, with a hand-knit scarf, clutching a canvas tote bag. Her hair was dark auburn, loosely braided over one shoulder, and her eyes were steady green-gray, like wet river stones. "I saw your note at the feed store," she said, voice calm but clear. "I'm here about the cooking job." He stared at her, trying to make sense of this moment. She looked like someone who'd stepped out of a different life, one that hadn't been burned through by loss. "I don't have time for trial runs or flattery," he said. 7 kids. No picky eaters, but they don't smile much. Neither do I. She smiled anyway. "I'm not here to be liked," she replied. "Just here to cook." That made him pause. He stepped aside slowly. "Kitchen's through there. Do your worst." She walked in, took off her coat, and asked where the flour was. 30 minutes later, the kitchen smelled like butter and cinnamon. Callan didn't say anything. He just stood at the hallway's edge, arms folded, watching this stranger in his kitchen, cracking eggs, rolling dough, humming quietly under her breath. The kids came home to the smell. Their eyes widened. Even Thatcher stood frozen at the doorway, the faintest flicker of confusion on his face. "What's that?" Isley asked, tugging her dad's sleeve. He didn't answer. He didn't know. That night, for the first time in months, all 7 children sat down to a hot meal. And for just a few minutes, there was no fighting, no crying, no staring blankly into plates. There was quiet chewing. There were seconds. And there was a look between Callan and the woman Delaney Wren that lasted longer than it should have. Not attraction. Not yet. But something else. Possibility. The morning sun inched up behind the cottonwoods, bathing the frost-covered fields in pale gold. Callan Brody had risen before dawn, as always. The day held no surprises until it did. The woman returned. He spotted her through the kitchen window, trudging up the gravel drive with that same worn canvas tote slung over her shoulder. She paused at the gate, glanced back once at the long road behind her, then stepped inside, as if she'd done it 100 times before. Callan opened the back screen door before she could knock. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said. Delaney Wren lifted her eyes to meet his steady as ever. "You didn't say I couldn't," she replied. He stepped aside again. No arguments. No pleasantries. She walked in. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the cinnamon rolls she'd made the day before, half a pan of which had been mysteriously emptied overnight. She set her bag on the counter, unzipped it, and pulled out a recipe notebook, so worn the edges curled like old bread crusts. Callan eyed it. "You planning to stay a while? Trial run," she said. "You'll know by the end of the week." He nodded once. Fair enough. Then she pulled out a folded square of fabric, a child's drawing embroidered into a tea towel. Callan looked closer. A small blue house, a bright orange sun, and 3 stick figures. She tucked it into the oven handle without a word. It wasn't for display. It was for presence. He didn't ask about it. The kids came home just after 3 snow boots thudding on the porch, voices rising like a pack of wild dogs. Delaney didn't flinch. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and greeted them each by name already memorized. Even Thatcher. They blinked at her like she was a ghost they weren't sure they believed in. "Hi, Miss Wren," Isley said softly. The others mumbled greetings. She leaned toward them, slightly lowering her voice. "There's cornbread in the oven and chili on the stove. But if you don't wash your hands first, I'll hide the good spoons." It wasn't a threat. It was a code. The children smiled. Even Thatcher smirked. Just a flicker. But Callan saw it. Dinner was a quiet affair, not out of awkwardness, but something closer to peace. The chili was smoky rich. The cornbread was soft and barely sweet. No one had seconds because everyone had thirds. Callan noticed that Delaney didn't eat. She poured herself coffee instead, then stood by the window watching the horizon arms folded loosely across her chest. When the kids cleared the table without being asked, He stepped toward her. "You always stand when people eat?" She shrugged. "Sometimes. Depends on how much I need to remember where I am." He tilted his head, trying to read between her lines. "You mean, you're not used to places like this?" She met his gaze. "I'm not used to staying." That night, after the children were asleep and the dishes done, Callan lingered in the hallway longer than usual. The house didn't creak as much, or maybe he just didn't hear it through the silence in his head. Delaney was packing up her tote bag when he returned to the kitchen. "You're leaving? I said I'd be here afternoons," she replied. "I'll be back tomorrow, same time." He folded his arms. "Where do you go? I rent a room above the old bookstore on Birch." A pause. "It's quiet." "No kitchen." Callan glanced at the fridge. "You're cooking for 8 people and going home to microwave soup." Delaney smiled. "Microwave's broken." He didn't offer her a meal. She didn't ask. But as she turned to go, he found himself saying, "The porch light stays on." She looked back, and in her gaze was a kindness too big for one moment. "So does mine," she said. Then she left. The next morning she came early. Too early for someone just doing afternoons. Callan opened the door in a faded t-shirt and jeans, still groggy boots unlaced. "You said afternoons. I made biscuits," she said, holding up a pan under foil. "Couldn't sleep." He stepped aside again. That was becoming a habit. She moved with quiet efficiency, her presence a rhythm rather than an intrusion. The kitchen warmed, the air filled with the scent of cheddar and herbs. He sipped coffee at the table, watching her slice peaches without looking down. Hands moving like she'd done this 1,000 times, with love not habit. "Why cooking?" he asked suddenly. She didn't look up. "Because I couldn't fix what I lost. But I can feed what's still hungry." It wasn't just an answer. It was a confession. Callan didn't know how to respond, so he said nothing. By the time the kids came down for breakfast, plates were already on the table. Penny gasped when she saw the peaches shaped into tiny hearts. "Did you do that just for us?" Delaney kneeled beside her. "Just for you." That day, the children laughed again, at nothing and everything. Callan stood at the threshold watching them, arms crossed, but heart open a crack wider than before. He still wasn't smiling, but he wasn't looking away either. The mornings were changing, slowly, quietly. Callan Brody noticed it first in the way the kettle no longer hissed alone. Delaney Wren had taken to arriving earlier, then agreed earlier than expected, always carrying something warm in foil and something cool in her eyes. That Tuesday she brought apple scones. "They're not sweet," she warned as she unwrapped the pan, "but they're honest." Callan didn't know what that meant, but they smelled like fall, like things worth remembering. He watched her move around the kitchen like she'd been born into it. She didn't ask where things were anymore. Her rhythm had settled in measured, soft, efficient. The coffee pot brewed without overboiling. The eggs didn't burn. The air didn't carry that acrid fog of desperation it used to when he tried to cook. The kids came down one by one, still in their mismatched socks and tangled hair, but their shoulders looked lighter. Penny even skipped. "You're back," she squealed, rushing to hug Delaney around the waist. "I said I would be." Delaney smiled, brushing a curl from Penny's forehead. Thatcher entered last. As always, tall for his age, and older in the eyes than he should have been. He nodded toward Delaney but didn't speak. She simply set a scone on his plate and turned back to the stove. No coaxing. No comment. No expectations. Breakfast moved in calm ripples. The children chewed past butter-traded jokes. Callan sat at the table but didn't eat. He just sipped his coffee and watched. Watched his children. Watched Delaney. Watched a version of life he hadn't dared to imagine 2 weeks ago. When the bus pulled away down the long gravel drive and the house quieted, he cleared his throat. "You always like mornings. Delaney glanced up from rinsing dishes. No, but I like starting something early. Gives you more time to fix it. He didn't respond, but the edge of his mouth twitched. She noticed, but she didn't say anything. That afternoon, Delaney returned with a basket of groceries. Fresh herbs, cornmeal, a loaf of something dense and homemade. Callan leaned on the doorway of the mudroom, arms folded. You didn't have to bring all that. She looked up from the bag. I did. I pay for ingredients. I know. He didn't like owing people. But something about the way she said it made it hard to argue. Instead, he said, You ever think about opening a bakery? Or something? I had one. Before. She didn't elaborate. He didn't press. Dinner that night was roasted chicken and green beans sautéed in garlic and lemon. Thatcher poked at the food in silence. The other kids devoured theirs. Callan caught his son's stillness the way he looked through the plate instead of at it. When dinner ended, Delaney handed Thatcher a dish towel. Help me dry. He hesitated, then stood slowly. Callan held his breath, but didn't intervene. At the sink, they worked side by side, quiet as rain on a roof. Delaney didn't make small talk. She handed him plates steady and warm, and he dried them one by one. After a while, she asked without looking at him, You like to build things? Thatcher shrugged. I saw the wooden train on the shelf upstairs. That yours? He nodded. I used to build pie racks with my dad, she said. We never talked much either, but our hands did. Thatcher paused. Mom used to say that too. Delaney looked over at him gently, not intrusively. She sounds like someone I would have liked. Thatcher didn't respond, but when the last plate was stacked, he didn't run off. He stood there another moment, then whispered, She made biscuits with cinnamon. Not the regular kind. The warm kind. Delaney nodded once, as if receiving instructions from a sacred recipe. I'll make them Thursday. And just like that, a crack opened in a wall. Later, after the kids went to bed, Callan sat in the armchair staring at the fire. Delaney stood in the doorway, her coat draped over one arm. Thatcher doesn't talk much, he said. I noticed. But he's always listening, always watching. I know. He looked up at her. You're good at this. Delaney's expression softened. At what? At making people want to stay at the table. She swallowed, glancing down. Her voice dropped an octave. That wasn't always the case. Callan tilted his head. What happened? Delaney met his gaze. There was something quiet and deep in her eyes, like a storm she'd already survived. My son was born early. 3 years ago. He didn't stay. The room froze for a moment, and not because of the Montana wind outside. Callan didn't speak, didn't know how to. He just nodded once deeply with the weight of a man who also knew how grief rearranged you. Then he said simply, Come back tomorrow. Delaney smiled. I was going to. The next morning, Callan woke to the smell of cinnamon. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't dread coming downstairs. The day began like most others, with frost laced across the windows and boots scattered on the porch. Callan Brody barely registered the date when he signed a school permission slip, poured stale cereal into 3 mismatched bowls, and tied his 6-year-old's shoes, one-handed, while sipping coffee with the other. Delaney wasn't due until the afternoon. The house felt heavier without her in it. Not louder, just more hollow. Callan chalked it up to habit. You get used to peace even if it's borrowed. At 7:45, the bus pulled away. 7 small faces pressed against foggy windows waving. One of them didn't. He noticed too late. By mid-morning, Callan was back at the barn, struggling with a busted water heater for the horse trough. The wind had picked up the kind that cut through denim and left him wishing for spring or a full-time handyman. But wishes were for people who had time. His phone buzzed. A message from Delaney. Need anything from the store? Making something special tonight. He stared at the text. Something about the phrasing made his chest tighten, though he couldn't explain why. He typed back, "Nope. Thanks." Then he pocketed the phone and got back to fixing things with his hands, because fixing with his heart was trickier. Delaney arrived at 3 sharp cheeks pink from the wind arms full of groceries, and something wrapped in a blue cloth. "Made a stop at Rose's Bakery," she said casually, lifting a box from the bag. "Thought we'd do something sweet tonight." Callan opened his mouth to ask, but she was already moving, chopping apples, heating butter, peeling potatoes, with a rhythm that had become its own language. He didn't see the small card peeking out from the box, corner, Happy 10th Isley, in a childlike scrawl. The kids tumbled through the front door at 3:45 in their usual flurry of backpacks and voices. Delaney greeted each one like a returning traveler, handing out sliced fruit and questions about spelling tests. Isley sat down quietly at the kitchen table. Her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes lacked their usual spark. Delaney noticed first. Callan didn't. Not until she whispered something that stopped him cold. "I know she didn't expect a party, but forgetting entirely, that's not like you." Callan blinked. "What are you talking about?" Delaney looked up, brow furrowing gently. "Today's Isley's birthday." The words hit like a hammer to the chest. He turned to his daughter, who now sat tracing the edge of her plate with her thumb, trying not to look disappointed. "Isley?" Callan cleared his throat. "Why didn't you say something this morning?" She shrugged. Didn't want to be a problem. That landed even harder. Colin had been so caught up in maintenance, in logistics, in surviving, he'd forgotten the one thing Marley had always protected, the children's sense of being seen. Isley had let the morning pass without a word, because she'd already learned her needs weren't priorities anymore. Dinner came early that night. Delaney set the table with more care than usual. She added cloth napkins, pulled out the chipped porcelain pitcher no one had used since Marley died, and placed a tiny wildflower in the center, despite the frost. She baked brown sugar pork, roast buttery mashed potatoes, and warm apples sautéed with cinnamon and clove. When Isley sat down, she looked confused. When Delaney placed a small cupcake in front of her, with a single candle, she looked stunned. But when Callan sat down across from her, slid a small hand-carved horse figurine across the table, and said softly, "I made it last week. Just for you," her eyes filled. "You remembered," she whispered. He could have lied, could have claimed he was waiting to surprise her. But lies weren't welcome at the table anymore. "No," he said honestly, "but I should have." And for once, the truth didn't ruin the moment, it redeemed it. Later that night, after dishes and stories and too many slices of cake, Delaney stood by the back door pulling on her coat. Callan approached with hesitant steps. "Thank you," he said. She didn't turn around. She needed to feel like someone was thinking about her. I should have been that someone. Delaney glanced back, her voice low but warm. "You're trying. That counts more than you think." He looked at her fully, now, taking in the woman who had walked into his kitchen 2 weeks ago, with nothing but recipes and silence, and somehow had rewritten the emotional temperature of the whole house. "I forgot my daughter's birthday," he said, almost to himself. Delaney studied him for a moment. "But you were the one who carved her something by hand when no one was looking. That's not forgetting. That's being buried." Callan swallowed hard. Buried in what she held his gaze. In grief, in guilt, in fear. He couldn't answer that. But he didn't deny it. The next morning, Isley woke up early to pack her own lunch peanut butter sandwich, sliced strawberries, and a folded note tucked into the bag that read, "You are not a problem. You are a gift." Dad Callan never mentioned it aloud. But when she hugged him goodbye tighter than usual, he knew she'd read it. And maybe, just maybe, it had been the first thing he'd done right in a long, long while. The sky began to darken by late afternoon, earlier than usual. A heavy stillness hung over the farm, thick and electric, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Delaney looked up from the chopping board, pausing with her hands dusted in flour. "Storm's coming," she murmured. Callan, hunched over a loose latch on the back door, barely looked up. Montana weather's never polite about it. She moved to the window. Distant lightning flickered behind the tree line, pale and soundless for now. "I should head back early," she said, drying her hands. "No," Callan replied instinctively, then caught himself. "Wait until it passes. Roads out here turn to soup in 10 minutes of rain." Delaney hesitated, studying the horizon. "I don't want to impose." "You're feeding half my county," he said without looking at her. "I think you've earned dinner." She smiled softly, then turned back to kneading dough for the chicken pot pie. "Then I'll make extra." By the time the kids tumbled through the door, at 4:00, thunder was already rolling low across the hills. The smell of butter, thyme, and roasted chicken filled the kitchen like a warm blanket. Penny clung to Delaney's leg immediately. "Is it going to be a big one?" Delaney knelt beside her. "Big thunder?" "Yes, but this house is strong. Promise." She wrapped her arms gently around the girl. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't." The rain came hard. By 5:30, the wind was screaming through the eaves. Tree branches scraped against the upstairs windows, and water leaked in slow drips from the seam above the back door. The power flickered once, then again, and finally went dark. The kitchen fell silent, save for the rain pounding the roof and the distant groan of bending trees. Isley gasped. One of the twins cried out. Penny ran straight into Delaney's arms and buried her face in the apron she'd already smeared with pie crust. Callan lit a lantern without a word. The glow was soft amber, not quite steady. "Upstairs," he said calmly. "Bring your blankets. All of you." The storm was moving east, but the worst of it was overhead now. Delaney stayed behind to cover the food and gather supplies. When she joined them upstairs, the children were already nestled in a quilted pile on the floor of the master bedroom, flashlights flickering in shaky patterns against the ceiling. Callan sat against the far wall, arms resting loosely on his knees. The tension in his shoulders was evident, even in shadow. Delaney entered quietly and passed him a folded towel for the leaking windowsill. He nodded, accepting it with a muttered thanks. She sank to the floor beside the kids. Penny immediately crawled into her lap, shivering. "I used to be scared of storms, too," Delaney said softly, brushing wet strands from Penny's forehead. "What made you stop?" Isley asked. Delaney smiled faintly. "Someone I loved told me to listen instead of fear. Listen to the quiet after the loud." Callan watched from across the room. The flickering light caught the edge of Delaney's profile, calm, solid, maternal, in a way that wasn't forced. The children responded to her, not because she demanded it, but because she offered refuge without asking anything in return. And it unnerved him, because refuge was dangerous. He stood and left the room without a word. Delaney found him 10 minutes later in the kitchen, staring at the half-uncovered pie on the counter, shoulders rigid, one hand braced on the edge of the sink. "You okay?" she asked. He didn't turn. This house used to be noisy during storms. Delaney said nothing. He went on. "Marley would pull out board games and blankets. We'd camp in the hallway. She'd turn candles into castles. The kids would laugh even when the trees howled." He paused. "I haven't heard them laugh during a storm since." Delaney stepped further into the kitchen but didn't speak. Callan finally turned, and his eyes, usually steady, guarded, were fractured tonight. "I feel like I'm failing all of them." She met his gaze. "You're not." "I forgot Isley's birthday. You remembered it the next day." "That's not the same." "No," she said gently. "But neither is grief. It doesn't move in straight lines." The wind rattled the windows again, louder this time, like a warning. Callan looked up then at her. "You staying?" Delaney lifted her chin slightly. If you're asking me that way, then yes, he nodded. And then, after a long beat, he said the one thing she hadn't expected. Stay the night. The couch is yours. Delaney studied him carefully, respectfully. Thank you, she said. I'll take care of breakfast. That night, after the kids had finally fallen asleep and the worst of the storm had passed, Delaney stood in the darkened kitchen, refolding napkins just to keep her hands busy. She looked toward the living room, where a blanket and pillow waited on the couch. And for the first time in a long time, the idea of staying, really staying, didn't feel like trespassing. It felt like beginning. The morning after the storm was uncommonly still. Mist hung low over the fields, as if the land itself had paused to breathe. Inside the Brody farmhouse, the children slept in scattered quilt piles across the living room floor, limbs tangled like seaweed in a tide. A single lamp cast its warm circle near the couch, where Delaney Wren lay, eyes already open. She hadn't really slept. The thunder had passed, but something else lingered. Not fear. Something quieter. Something that asked whether she had stayed too long or not long enough. In the kitchen, Callan was already making coffee. He didn't turn when she entered. You snore, he said gruffly, a hint of dry humor beneath the surface. Delaney raised a brow. I do not. He smirked. Maybe it was one of the twins. She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter. For a moment they stood in companionable silence, listening to the birds pick up their morning chorus. You stayed, he said at last, not looking at her. You asked. He nodded once, then took a long sip from his mug, like it cost him more to say thank you than it should. By the time the children woke, Delaney was already halfway through making breakfast. They swarmed the table in their usual half-dressed chaos, except for Thatcher. He came in last as usual, shirt tucked too tightly into his jeans, hair damp from a rushed rinse. He offered a quiet morning and sat in silence, eyes fixed on the toast he didn't touch. Delaney passed him the butter without a word. He took it, but didn't meet her eyes. That evening, a surprise visitor knocked at the door. It was Paul Kirchner, Callan's longtime friend, and the closest thing their remote corner of Montana had to a contractor/confidant. He came bearing fence wire and his usual blunt opinions. I saw your cook out at the market, he said, as he stepped inside, stamping mud off his boots. She yours, Callan's jaw tightened. She works here. Paul grinned, oblivious. Well, you better hold on to her. Smells like real food in this place again. Marley'd be impressed. The room stiffened. Delaney, who had just set a bowl of fresh greens on the table, paused, but said nothing. The children fell quiet, even the twins. Callan didn't look at Paul. Instead, he said evenly, We're just grateful to eat together again. But the ghost had already entered. Dinner proceeded with a strained kind of grace. Delaney ladled out bowls of beef stew, her movements precise, her eyes unreadable. Callan sat at the head of the table, speaking little, his shoulders tight. Across from him, Thatcher chewed mechanically, watching everything. Watching her. Finally, he broke the silence. Was Mom better at this? The question landed like thunder. Callan looked up sharply. What Thatcher's voice was steady, too steady. At cooking. Was she better? Callan set down his spoon. She cooked different things. That's not what I asked. Delaney froze with a dish in her hand. She didn't dare look at either of them. Callan's voice dropped. Why are you asking that? Because everyone's acting like nothing changed, Thatcher replied. Like it's normal now to laugh and eat and pretend she's not gone. Isley looked down at her lap. Penny clutched her spoon tighter. Callan's knuckles whitened around his glass. No one's pretending. Thatcher stood abrupt. She's not our mom. Stop acting like she is. Delaney set the dish down, hands trembling just slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't run. She just nodded once and began clearing plates. Callan remained seated, eyes burning with something between anger and shame. "She never tried to be," he said finally. "You just assumed she wanted to." But Thatcher had already disappeared into the hallway after the kids had been settled, some in tears, some in silence. Delaney stood alone at the sink, washing dishes no one had dirtied. Callan appeared beside her with a dish towel in hand, but she didn't hand him anything. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's not your fault. He's grieving." "So am I," she said, more to herself than to him. He looked at her sharply. "I'm not trying to take anyone's place," she continued. "I know what it feels like to lose someone who couldn't be replaced." Callan set down the towel. "Who was he?" Delaney's hand stilled in the water. "My son. Cole. He lived for 31 hours. The kitchen seemed to shrink in on itself. I held him," she whispered, voice barely audible, "until he didn't breathe anymore." Callan said nothing for a long time. Then he reached for the dish in her hand and dried it wordlessly. Later that night, Delaney placed a plate outside Thatcher's bedroom door. Just a roll and a small slice of apple pie. No note. In the morning, the plate was empty and sitting neatly in the sink. And that, in its own quiet way, was an answer. Saturday morning broke with the smell of wet earth and something like spring hanging in the air, tentative, uncertain, but present. Delaney Wren stood at the kitchen counter early, alone, sleeves rolled, hands in a bowl of warm dough. The window was cracked an inch, letting in a breeze that smelled faintly of pine and thaw. She didn't hum, didn't rush. Bread, she'd learned, demanded attention, not speed. Across the room, a notebook sat open on the table. Inside, the scribbled pencil lines of a recipe, half hers, half scribbled in childish scrawl. She ran her fingers over it before folding it shut. It wasn't her handwriting. It was Thatcher's. The night before, after the storm had passed, the house had settled into an unexpected hush. Delaney had gone to bed, thinking the silence would stretch, that the wall between them had solidified. But this morning, Thatcher had appeared in the kitchen, while the sun was still low, pajama pants dragging, holding an old wooden box. Inside were measuring cups, spoons, and a recipe card worn so thin it had become translucent. "My mom taught me how to bake this," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. "But I forgot the steps." Delaney didn't say anything. She just moved aside and made space for him. Now he sat at the other end of the table watching the dough rise, arms crossed, foot tapping, anxious, unsure. "Yeast is weird," he mumbled. Delaney looked up. "It is. But you feed it and it grows. That's kind of creepy." She smiled. "So is grief sometimes. It swells up when you're not looking." Thatcher didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. By mid-morning, the other kids had woken to the scent of warm bread and the shock of Thatcher sitting calmly at the kitchen table. "You're baking," Isley whispered, as if speaking too loud might break the spell. Thatcher shrugged. "Just helping." Penny crawled onto Delaney's lap and peeked over the counter. "Are there raisins?" "No raisins," Delaney said. "But there's honey." "Good," Penny declared. "Raisins are sneaky." The whole kitchen erupted in quiet laughter. Even Thatcher let a smirk slip, which made Callan pause in the doorway longer than he meant to. He didn't enter. Just stood there, watching, arms, folded, heart doing something unfamiliar in his chest. Delaney handed Thatcher a knife. "Score the top." He blinked. "What make a mark? A shape? Anything. It helps the crust expand while it bakes." He hesitated, then pressed a single line, simple, deliberate, across the top of the dough. Delaney nodded. "Clean. Honest." He looked up. Mom used to call it the breath. Said, bread needs to breathe or it'll split the wrong way. She was right. They slid the pan into the oven together, hands brushing briefly. While the bread baked, the kids played a loud game of card towers and knockdowns in the living room. Delaney washed mixing bowls in the sink, the kitchen quieter again, but warmer. Thatcher lingered. "Why'd you come here?" he asked, suddenly eyes fixed on a sunbeam caught in the windowsill dust. Delaney rinsed the last bowl and turned off the tap. "Because I was tired of cooking for no one." He nodded slowly, digesting more than the answer. "I miss her," he said. "I don't want to forget her." Delaney leaned on the counter. "Then don't. But you're here now, and everyone's acting like that's okay." She paused. "It can be both, Thatcher. You can miss her and still let someone care about you." He frowned. "What if that's not fair?" Delaney walked over, pulled the oven open slightly. The smell of fresh bread filled the room, rich, yeasty golden. "She left behind something good," she said. "This family. You. That's the part you carry forward. That's what's fair." Thatcher didn't speak, but when the bread came out, he stood beside her, hand on the potholder, and helped her lift it with care. They placed it on the cooling rack in silence. Delaney handed him a small butter knife. "Want the first slice?" Thatcher hesitated, then nodded. He cut slowly, not neatly, and handed her half. "You first," he said. Delaney took the warm, uneven piece, bit into it, and let out a soft, surprised sound. What he asked, eyes narrowing. "It's good," she said. "You sound surprised. I'm just thinking how proud your mom would be." For a moment, something moved behind his eyes, too quick, too delicate to name. But he stood a little taller as he took his own bite. That night, Callan watched his children eat with full mouths and clean plates. He looked to his right, where Delaney sat, arms, flour-dusted hair, loose laughter, quiet. Across from them, Thatcher offered her the butter without being asked. The gesture was small, but for Callan Brody, it felt like a turning point, not just in the room, but inside himself. After dinner, as the sky turned lavender, Callan joined Delaney on the porch steps. "Thatcher doesn't let people in easy," he said. "I wasn't trying to get in. That's probably why it worked." A long pause. Then softer, "I made a lot of mistakes. I still am." Delaney smiled at the horizon. The bread didn't rise right the first time either. He glanced at her. "Yeah, but it still fed someone." The phone call came on a Tuesday, tucked between the leftover meatloaf and the promise of early spring. Delaney had just pulled a tray of blueberry muffins from the oven when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it absently, then froze. Unknown number, Sheridan, Wyoming. Her breath hitched. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped outside, letting the screen door creak shut behind her. "Hello," a woman's voice answered. "Ms. Wren, this is Susan McAllister from Oak Pines Assisted Living. We've been trying to reach you." Delaney's heart sank. "Is it my grandmother?" "Yes, she's taken a turn. Mild stroke this morning. She's stable, but you may want to come soon." Delaney leaned against the porch, post knuckles whitening around the towel. "How soon?" There was a pause. "Tonight, if possible." She didn't tell Callan right away. Instead, she finished dinner, like she always did, quietly, precisely, lovingly. The kids laughed through their mashed potatoes. Thatcher even told a joke. Penny recited a poem she made up about chickens and dragons. Isley helped serve dessert. Delaney laughed. She smiled. But she did not stay. She hung her apron with deliberate care and grabbed her tote bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped the counter one last time. Callan met her in the mudroom, brow furrowed. "You heading out early?" Delaney didn't meet his eyes. "Something's come up. What is it?" She paused. "I have to go to Wyoming." "Family." His expression shifted. Not anger, not confusion, something else. "Is it serious?" Delaney nodded. "It's my grandmother. She raised me." He stepped back slightly, clearing the doorway for her. "When will you be back? I don't know." Callan's jaw flexed. He nodded once tightly. She walked past him. But at the door, she stopped. "I didn't plan on staying this long," she said softly. "I didn't plan on needing you," he replied. And just like that, the silence between them became something that hurt. That night, the Brody house felt too quiet. The kids noticed immediately. "Is Miss Delaney sick?" Penny asked. "No," Callan said. "She had to visit someone." "Will she be back?" Isley whispered. Callan didn't answer, because he didn't know. The next morning breakfast was a disaster. The eggs burned. The toast caught fire. One of the twins poured orange juice on a bowl of dry cereal by mistake. Nobody laughed. Callan tried, really tried, but the rhythm was gone. The center had shifted, and he could feel it in every footstep that didn't echo quite right. He found a note on the fridge, a list of meals for the next 3 days written in Delaney's careful print. At the bottom, in case I don't make it back right away. D. It felt like a goodbye. Days passed slowly. Delaney arrived in Wyoming under a gray sky and the kind of hospital light that made even strong people look faded. Her grandmother, once fiercely independent, the woman who taught her how to thread a needle and roast a chicken, was small now, fragile. They spoke in murmurs. Delaney stayed 2 nights at the assisted living center. The 3rd night, she sat by the window, watching the wind push branches against the glass, and felt the strange pull of a place that used to be home but wasn't anymore. Back in Montana, she had 7 children she hadn't given birth to, and a man who barely spoke his heart. And yet, it was them she missed. On the 4th morning, she opened her grandmother's pantry to make breakfast and wept, because it was empty, because there were no fingerprints on the fridge door, because no one would fight over who got the corner muffin. That night, as she lay in the quiet dark, her grandmother asleep beside her, Delaney whispered into the room, "I think I left something behind." And for the first time, she understood it wasn't something. It was someone. At the Brody house, Isley found a jar Delaney had left on the top shelf peach jam with a sticky note on it, for when toast needs magic. She clutched it like treasure. Penny asked to sleep with one of Delaney's oven mitts. Thatcher stopped saying grace aloud at dinner. And Callan, for all his quiet, stood in front of the kitchen doorway. One night after dinner, stared at the empty space beside the stove and said aloud to no one, "Come home." Delaney returned on a Sunday afternoon, dust on her boots, face drawn from the road. She didn't knock. Callan opened the door before she could. Neither spoke. He stepped back. She entered. The kitchen hadn't changed, but she had. She placed her bag down, slowly took a breath, and said, "If I'm going to keep walking away, you better tell me now." Callan didn't move, didn't blink. "You can't," he said finally. "We're already waiting." It was the first Sunday in April when Delaney stayed through dinner. Not just to serve it, not just to clear the plates, but to sit. Not at the counter. Not on the edge of the action. At the table. The chair had always been there on the side between Thatcher and Isley, but tonight, Callan pulled it out deliberately. He didn't say anything. He just stood behind it, one hand resting lightly on the wooden back, waiting. Delaney paused, a spoon still in her hand, unsure if the invitation was real or symbolic. "Sit, Miss Delaney," Penny chirped. "This one's yours." The small girl patted the seat, as if to prove ownership. Callan's eyes met Delaney's across the table. "You've earned it," he said quietly. And so she sat. The meal was chicken and rice with warm biscuits, a simple dish Callan had attempted the week Delaney left. This time, she made it. The children knew the difference instantly, but no one said it out loud. They just reached for seconds and passed the butter with something that felt like reverence. Across the table, Thatcher broke his biscuit in half and nudged one piece toward Delaney's plate. She accepted it wordlessly. That was how bridges were built in this house, one act of grace at a time. After the plates were cleared, Callan reached under the table and pulled out something wrapped in a kitchen towel. It was long, narrow, carved by hand. The wood had been sanded smooth, stained a warm chestnut. Delaney looked puzzled. Callan unwrapped it, slowly revealing a wooden plaque with painted lettering etched carefully in soft curved script. "This table feeds 8." At the corner was a small handprint in flour sealed under varnish. "Pennies. I started it when you were gone," Callan said, not meeting her eyes. "Finished it yesterday." Delaney touched the surface gently. The wood was warm from his hands. The letters imperfect, but heartfelt. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Then don't," he replied. "Just stay." Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed and the dishes had been done without anyone being asked, Callan poured 2 cups of tea, 1 sweet, 1 plain, and joined Delaney on the back porch. The air smelled like new grass and the promise of rain. Delaney wrapped her fingers around the mug. "I didn't think I'd come back." "You did. I wasn't sure if you'd let me." Callan leaned back in the creaking porch chair. "I wasn't sure I'd know how." A long silence. Then she said, "You carved something permanent for someone who hasn't promised to stay." He nodded. "Because I'm not asking you to promise, just asking you to keep coming back." Delaney looked down into her tea. "That's the first thing anyone's asked me that didn't come with strings." "No strings," he said softly. "Just biscuits and chairs and little girls who think you hung the moon." Delaney laughed, really laughed, and set her mug down beside his. "They think you did too." He raised an eyebrow. "I haven't done anything right in a long time." "You've done something right every day since I met you," she said. "You just forgot to give yourself credit." Inside, the plaque had already been mounted. Above it, a new coat hook hung on the wall. Besides 7 smaller ones, it was slightly taller, sturdier. Delaney hadn't seen it yet, but she would. The next morning she arrived early. The coffee was already brewing. The sunlight hit the floorboards in long golden strokes. And her apron, the soft gray one with the stitched initials and little blue bird, was hanging from that 8th hook. Delaney reached for it slowly, like touching something sacred. She slipped it on and began the day. It wasn't a grand gesture that changed everything. It was the way Callan started coming in from the barn 5 minutes earlier, wiping his hands on the same faded cloth, asking, "Need anything chopped?" It was how Delaney stopped measuring flour precisely when Penny insisted that a big scoop of love made pancakes fluffier. It was the quiet click of a mug being set beside another mug without asking how the other took their coffee. And it was the laughter steady now, like a spring that no longer feared its own thaw. On Tuesday morning, Delaney entered the kitchen to find Callan already at the stove, turning bacon with more confidence than grace. "Now you're just showing off," she said, hanging her apron on the 8th hook. He grinned, not looking up. "I figured if I burned it, you'd jump in." "Smart man." He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over without ceremony. "Milk. 1 sugar." She blinked. "You remembered. You take care of 7 kids, a moody ex-firefighter, and a house full of squeaky doors. Remembering your coffee order felt like the least I could do." Delaney sipped slowly, smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I could get used to this. By midweek, the rhythm between them had evolved into something fluid, wordless and intuitive. She moved to the fridge. He opened the drawer. She stirred the soup. He set the table. One morning, Delaney reached to brush a curl from Penny's forehead and accidentally bumped into Callan as he leaned over to pick up a dropped spoon. Their arms brushed. Both froze for a fraction of a second, then relaxed, as if the contact had been inevitable. "I think we've finally stopped orbiting," he said under his breath. Delaney looked up, and I'm not scared of falling anymore. That evening, they made cinnamon rolls. Real ones, soft, golden, rolled by small, eager hands, and sprinkled with sugar like it was stardust. The kitchen buzzed with music from a scratched-up radio, and the chatter of 7 children all convinced their roll was the best. Thatcher volunteered to make the frosting. No one said a word about it, but Delaney saw the way Callan's shoulders softened. And when Thatcher handed her the spoon to taste test, Callan caught her eye from across the kitchen. That was the moment she knew this was a home again. They didn't talk much about Marley anymore, not because she was forgotten, but because she was remembered right. Her memory had been folded into the dough of their days, sweetened and respected. Nothing forced, nothing erased. One night, Isley brought out an old photo album. "We want to show Miss Delaney," she said, holding it up like it contained treasure. Callan stiffened just a little. Delaney paused, hands still damp from washing dishes. "Only if you want to." Thatcher was the one who said she should know where we came from. They sat on the floor after dinner, children, Delaney, and eventually Callan. The photos were faded, but familiar. Marley on a swing, the kids in Halloween costumes, Callan holding a baby, Penny hair longer face rounder. Delaney listened, asked gently, laughed when they laughed. When she reached the last page, someone had added a new photo, all 8 of them at the table. Delaney in the center, a place set in permanence. Later that week, Callan found her in the pantry organizing spices alphabetically, something no one had done in years. He leaned in the doorway, arms folded. "You do realize cumin doesn't care where you put it, right?" She didn't look up. "Maybe. But I do." He tilted his head. "You like order. I like love disguised as order," she replied. He stepped inside. "You ever think about what it would look like to stay?" She turned to face him. "You asking me to?" He hesitated. Not out loud yet. Delaney smiled soft and steady. "Well, when you do, I'll pretend to be surprised." On Saturday, the family took a picnic to the edge of the pasture. The sun was warm but not harsh, the grass still waking up from winter. They spread out a worn quilt. Delaney passed sandwiches. Penny handed out juice boxes. The twins played tag with no rules. Thatcher leaned against a tree, sketching something no one asked to see. Callan sat beside Delaney, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. "It's a lot of noise," he said. She looked around. "It's a lot of life." He exhaled. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm just holding it all together with duct tape and prayer." She turned to him, eyes clear. "You're not holding it together, Callan. You built something new from broken pieces. And it's stronger than it looks." He swallowed hard. "That scares me." She reached out, finally closing the inch of space between them, resting her hand lightly over his. "It scares me too. But this," she gestured to the chaos, "the joy, the crumbs in the grass, this is worth being brave for." That night, as they cleaned the kitchen together, Callan found a piece of paper tucked beneath the bread box. It was a note. Penny's handwriting. "When people love each other, they make each other toast." Callan handed it to Delaney without a word. She laughed, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the recipe book, right between cinnamon rolls and chicken and rice, where it belonged. Easter morning arrived with soft light and bird song, the kind of morning that made everything feel like a beginning. Callan Brody stood in the kitchen early, barefoot on the cold floorboards, flipping pancakes that weren't perfectly round and didn't need to be. He had let Delaney sleep in something she rarely allowed herself to do, and something he had to talk her into with quiet insistence and a kiss on the forehead. That was new, the kiss. But it hadn't felt strange. It had felt inevitable. The kids had taken to whispering lately. Hushed conversations in corners, secret glances, odd requests for glue sticks and ribbon. Something was brewing. Callan suspected a surprise was coming, but he didn't expect the door knock at 9:00 a.m., just as he set the last plate on the table. He opened the door to find Pastor Riley and his wife Ruth standing with a bouquet of daisies and 2 foil-covered pans. "We heard your cook's been working miracles," Ruth said, beaming. Callan grinned. "She's not a cook. She's Delaney?" "Well," the pastor said, stepping in, "I hope she's ready to be celebrated." The living room filled fast. Friends from town, neighbors with casseroles, kids in their Sunday best who couldn't sit still. The Brody house, once quiet and hollow, now thrummed with life and color. Delaney appeared in the doorway just as Ruth placed a crown of wildflowers on Penny's head. Her hair was tousled cheeks flushed with sleep. She blinked at the crowd in wonder. "What is all this?" Isley tugged her hand. "We made a surprise." Delaney followed the child's lead into the dining room where the table had been decorated with handmade placemats, each one drawn by a different child. Hers was at the head of the table. Above it hung a new sign scribbled in bold, imperfect lettering. "Our family is full. Thanks to you." Delaney stared at it, one hand covering her mouth. Callan stepped behind her, voice low in her ear. "They wanted to tell you how they feel." She turned to face him. "And how do you feel?" He didn't hesitate. "I feel like I'd rather grow old beside you than go one more day pretending this isn't real." Her breath caught. Callan pulled a small ring from his pocket. Not a diamond, but a slim silver band, hammered by hand, etched with the tiniest engraving on the inside. "One meal at a time." He didn't kneel. He just held it out, eyes steady. "I'm not asking you to be anyone you're not. I'm not asking you to fix what can't be fixed. I'm just asking you to keep cooking beside me. Keep sitting at the table. Keep coming back." Delaney didn't cry. Not yet. She took the ring, slipped it on slowly, and whispered, "I never left." The celebration was messy and beautiful. Potlucked dishes lined the counters, mismatched plates, clinked, lemonade spilled without apology. Penny made a toast with chocolate milk. Thatcher told a joke that actually landed. The twins started a whipped cream war that ended in laughter and mopping. Callan and Delaney moved through it all like a pair who had been in step for years. No one gave a speech. No one needed to, because the table said everything. That night, when the house had emptied and the stars settled into their places, Delaney stood on the back porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the wind move through the trees. Callan joined her with 2 cups of tea. "Tomorrow's Monday," she said. "It is. Back to school. Lunch boxes. Crumbs under the sink." He smiled. "Back to real life." She nodded. "You still want this?" "All of it," he said. "Even the raisins." Delaney laughed fully, freely, the way she hadn't in years. "You're sure?" He stepped closer, touched her hand. "I want ordinary. With you." Inside the kitchen glowed under the soft lamplight. 7 backpacks hung neatly. 8 aprons waited. And at the center of the table, surrounded by the crumbs and fingerprints of a life being well lived, sat a small folded note in Penny's handwriting. "We didn't know we needed a mom again. But now we do. Please stay." Delaney picked it up, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "I already have. And sometimes the most extraordinary miracles happen right around a dinner table." Thank you for joining us for this story, a story about love healing and how a warm meal can open the door to something far greater. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Take a moment to say hello in the comments. We truly enjoy hearing from you. And if this story touched your heart, feel free to subscribe so you can join us again next time. We have many more stories waiting to be shared with you. From our family to yours, thank you for spending your time here. It means more than you know.